You are now listening to Aristogenesis, Episode 3, Initiation of the Hero, presented to you by nordistradio.se.
In this episode, we're returning to the ancient Indo-Europeans and delving deeper into their everyday lives. We're going to be exploring the intricacies of their lifestyles, from their caste system to their economy, and of course their warfare, an art at which the Indo-Europeans would prove particularly adept. We're going to be looking into what it was that set them apart from all others, and what it took to make them rise above their enemies and conquer the known world. Time and time again, throughout their mythology and throughout the mythologies of their descendants, known to us as the greatest empires the world has ever known, from Greece, Rome and Persia in times of antiquity, to the Nordic conquerors of the Viking Age, to the colonial powers of recent years. Throughout the tales of these people, both those they told themselves and those written of them, in esoteric myth or mainstream history, one thing ties them all together: the hero. The man willing to risk life and limb for the greater good of his folk, honoured in the eyes of men and gods alike. From Alexander the Great to Ivar the Boneless, from the Spartans at Thermopylae to the Battle of Rorke's Drift, their heroism still captures our love and utmost admiration to this very day. The hero is timeless and eternal, demigods in their own right. And now, more than ever, it is imperative that we keep the memories of our heroes undiluted and come to understand what made them into who they were and who we must become. We're going to begin by talking about the ancient Indo-Europeans, what made them so special, and how they defined the hero's path. We're going to start off by discussing the economy of these ancient people and look into how they traded with one another and kept their communities self-sustaining. While on the outside this may not seem as engaging or enthralling as their expansionist conquests or their initiatory rites and traditions, upon further inspection there are fascinating and sophisticated details and a real nuance to their economic system that we, in the modern day, would do well to learn from. When looking at the economics of the Aryans, it isn't a stretch to say that it was essentially a non-capitalist one, with trade and bartering between kinfolk being the crux of their economy. Status and prestige was nigh on impossible to achieve through purely economic means, as in the accumulation and hoarding of wealth. In fact, the opposite seems to be the case. Political rivals would attempt to out-generous one another, competing by throwing huge feasts and banquets to please both their people and their gods. They may not have used currency, but this shouldn't be regarded as the custom of simpletons who couldn't create a form of coinage. As the Scythians, Indo-European contemporaries of the ancient Greeks, the height of their power, known for their extreme adherence to the old Indo-European cultures, deliberately shunned the use of coinage purely on principle, despite reportedly having vast quantities of gold jewellery of the finest craftsmanship. These ancient Aryans knew well of trade within their own communities and kinfolk, and trade, as well as the economy in general, was based around cattle and agricultural goods. Of course, different communities had their own ways of sourcing such goods with which to trade, some being more inclined to farm, and others retained a nomadic pastoralist lifestyle. As with any group that splits off into small communities in such a vast area of land, with such varying climates, temperatures and terrains, each community settled into a way of life that suited their environment. Even at this early stage, our ancestors were already showing the unique combination of fanatical devotion to their traditions and an environmental flexibility that would make them so successful as a collective. We are at once both steadfast and adaptable, and such early examples show that these unique and defining traits are in our very nature as a people, rather than coming about through any external force. One thing certainly sticks out in terms of their trade with outside groups. One group of Indo-Europeans from the northern Caucasus region had a chieftain buried wearing ancient Mesopotamian symbols of power, and the tribe had a number of Mesopotamian clay-spun pots in their possession. Trade is, of course, only the official explanation for such an odd discovery. Perhaps, though, however unlikely, there could have been more between this humble tribe and the ancient Mesopotamians, whose own writings and records seem to hint at just that. But we will return to the ancient Mesopotamians at a later date. As mentioned in our earlier episodes, Indo-European society was built on a foundation of trust, bound by oaths taken before the gods and held together by ethnic, tribal ties. This attitude was applied to all aspects throughout Indo-European life, and thus their economic system became one of reciprocation. When warriors and explorers would have to travel huge distances with very limited supplies, men already established along the way would be expected to provide food and shelter to these weary travellers from amongst their kinfolk, with the expectation that their guest, now bound by a sacred oath, would repay him one way or another, and this debt could pass down onto one's descendants if left unpaid. The repayment was typically not through mere commodities, and interest rates were an alien concept to these noble warriors. It's worthy of note that two men who entered into this host-guest oath would refer to one another as gosti, the root word for both host and guest in English. This idea of a host and guest being one and the same links back with the aforementioned point of trade being the giving of mutual gifts. In fact, the words for to give and to take are also the same verb in ancient Indo-European, which shows that there was a running theme of balance and reciprocation that ran throughout all aspects of their society. After all, what is honour but reciprocation? When you are treated well, it is the honourable thing to repay such treatment. If you are attacked or betrayed, it is the honourable thing to repay such slights in kind. Of course, this is the reason that Indo-European peoples give sacrifices and offerings to their gods, rather than mere prayers. It is a sign of reciprocation, entering into the host-guest pact, called xenia by the Greeks, with the gods themselves. Now that we've established how important this idea of reciprocation was to these Indo-Europeans, how did it apply to their economic system? Well, due to the aforementioned lack of any financial currency, and the trading of goods being the chief form of currency, a system of bartering naturally developed. All trade was thought of as gift-giving, and all gifts would have to be repaid, so to speak. What this means is the Indo-European system of honour and goodwill towards kinsmen, and their revulsion towards debt of any kind, governed their economic system, and trade strengthened the bonds within a tribe. The rich could not take advantage of the poor, as both parties could only exchange goods of equal value, but nobles, who were the guardians of their tribe, wouldn't ever have even considered such a dishonourable act as exploiting their own kinsmen for the sake of material wealth. Now, we in the modern day can only admire this system that was built around traditions of the Aryans, which shunned material wealth and instead promoted trade as a means to provide for the kinsfolk, free from any dubious banking systems or any capitalist oligarchs pulling the strings from behind closed doors. A system in which the kinsfolk was more important than wealth, and wealth was used to provide for the kinsfolk. So it would seem that even in the most mundane aspects of Indo-European life, there are still so many fantastic lessons for us to learn. We can see that the inner working of their lifestyles created a stable foundation, but this alone couldn't have been responsible for their indomitable prowess on the battlefield. That came down to a combination of cultural, technological, and physical characteristics that were unlike any other group of people on the face of the earth. In terms of physicality, it's obvious. The Indo-Europeans were, especially compared to their neighbours, huge. They were both tall and wide in stature and full of muscle. This was a combination of genetics, lifestyle, and diet. Genetically, we can see that historically, up until the modern day, people in colder regions are generally taller, and these men, originally hailing from the far north, were no different. Their bodies tempered by their hard lifestyles in the cold of the north and the heat of battle. They were bred into the greatest fighting force of their age. In terms of their diet, it was almost exclusively meat and dairy, unsurprising for a culture of pastoral, cow-herding, semi-nomadic warriors. Their naturally large stature, coupled with their excellent diet, made these men into nigh-on invincible killing machines. Cows, being central to the Indo-European way of life, would naturally also become incredibly important in Indo-European myth. In fact, one of the earliest myths that we have been able to decipher involves a man called Trito, who is known as the first warrior. His quest was to recover the theft of his people's cattle herd. He then brings the cows back and offers them to the priest in order to give them in sacrifice to the gods. Trito's name appears to mean the third, and is emblematic of the trifold caste system of king, priest, and warrior. This thereby establishes the sanctity of the cows as integral to their lives, as well as the connection between the gods, the priests, and the warriors, and the necessity of war, struggle, and sacrifice to the gods in order to protect one's own people. There are also a great many later Aryan myths involving cattle thefts, partaken by the crew of Odysseus, or the newborn Hermes, for example. These myths are thought to reflect the proliferation and significance of cattle raiding, which was thought to have been integral to survival, at least at certain times. In Norse mythology, it is a sacred cow that reveals the gods trapped in the ice and feeds Ymir. In Hinduism, Krishna grows up as a cowherder. In Greek mythology, Apollo, the god of the Hyperboreans, has a flock of sacred red cows that were not to be touched. Curiously enough, I myself have visited the temple of Mithras at Hadrian's Wall, and Mithras was often equated with Helios and Apollo as the solar god. Surrounding the temple, which lays in the middle of an open field, there is a herd of red cows that are incredibly friendly to visitors. In India, of course, the cows are still famously held in reverence, and while beef is forbidden, milk and dairy products maintain high popularity in dishes across India, despite the population being largely lactose intolerant. Unlike the Indian reverence for cows as a kind of untouchable animal, however, the Indo-Europeans used them in sacrifices to the gods, as well as for their meat and hides in a more general way. Going back to the Indo-Europeans as a people, in terms of their technology, perhaps their axes and spears may not have been anything particularly noteworthy, but all things pale in comparison to their most crucial of inventions. First came the domestication of the horse, a great feat in and of itself, but these horses were short and stocky, far from the purpose-bred forces of nature that would fill the battlefields of antiquity and medieval Europe. A little-known fact regarding horses that should be more well-known given how obvious it is that they cannot be made to charge directly onto an infantry line. These creatures even now will spook at the slightest disturbance on the roads, so trying to get what was little more than a short, wide, wild animal to throw itself into the fray of combat would prove almost impossible. The horses, therefore, would instead be used to carry goods and people in a more civilian capacity, while warfare would be fought predominantly on foot. All of that soon changed, however. One man, whose name is now tragically lost to history, had an idea that would change not only the future of his own tribe, but shape the the entire world. And thus began the age of the war chariot. Both physically and throughout mythology, the chariot plays an integral role in the spread of the Indo-European people and their mighty conquest across Europe and Asia. The chariot, at the time of its invention, would have made its rider into an unstoppable juggernaut. The primitive weapons and tactics of their enemies, coupled with the flat lands of the steppe, would have made stopping a chariot charge virtually impossible, especially for the relatively pacifistic people who inhabited their surrounding land. When thinking of this, it is easy to imagine oneself as the noble Aryan stood atop his chariot, covered in glory and eternal victory, victory won in the name of his people and in the name of his gods. Who these gods were exactly, we will be covering in the next episode. These men are our ancestors, those who soaked the soil in the blood of lesser men. It is harder, however, to imagine the sheer terror and pitiful plight of those doomed to face them in battle. To imagine seeing an army approaching on the horizon, the very earth trembling as they draw near. To see these pale-skinned warriors, their chariots, their unstoppable war machine, eradicating anyone foolish enough to stand in their way. These towering, invincible gods amongst men, unrelenting, unyielding forces of nature, it becomes easy to see how they ruled as masters of Europe and Asia, and why those they encountered would often rather bend the knee than face certain annihilation at the hands of these men. Chariots also retained their symbolic significance, even when they were no longer used in combat, phased out in favour of cavalry with horses that had finally been bred to be large and fierce enough so as not to require the accompanying chariot. In Rome, even when chariots were no longer used on the battlefield, chariot racing was still incredibly popular. In fact, the best paid athlete in all of human history is the Roman chariot racer Gaius Apuleius Diocles, who, in a single day, earned more than a Roman procurator's annual wage. If he lived today, he would have been worth approximately $16 billion. The ancient Britons, however, were still using chariots as the main form of warfare for the nobility, even during the Roman invasions, with Julius Caesar meeting with hundreds of them, offering fierce resistance to his landing. Long before they were phased out, however, these chariots were a symbol of near immortality on the battlefield and became associated with the gods themselves. And this association stuck. Even long after the use of chariots in warfare had passed, the gods were still depicted in chariots. Apollo is once again the most famous example of this, with his chariot being drawn by horses across the sky as dawn breaks. But there are other gods who are likewise said to ride chariots, such as Mars or Ares, Diana, Thor, Freya, and others. There is also an obvious comparison to be drawn between Apollo and Dagger in the Norse tradition, as well as Sol, existing as a solar deity in both Roman and Norse religions, though the Roman Sol was a god and the Norse Sol was a goddess. Chariots also appear in the Bible during the war between Judah and its neighbours. For example, Judges chapter 1 verse 19 depicts Judean soldiers going to war with Indo-Europeans, and despite having the full backing of their God, the God of the Old Testament, they are still unable to overcome these chariot-mounted warriors. It says, Yahweh was with the men of Judah. They took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had chariots fitted with iron. This single passage alone raises many questions, as it seems that the God of the Bible himself is virtually powerless against these warriors, something that I am sure we will elaborate on sometime in the future. However, returning to the Indo-European perspective, These chariot riders are perfect examples of heroes, men risking life and limb in order to expand the dominion of their people. The word hero is derived from the Indo-European word erios, which is also the root of the word Aryan. Therefore, it is not too much of a stretch for us to say that hero and Aryan are one and the same. But is that all that makes a hero? Both hero and savage are capable of acts of war, so what is it that sets the hero apart from the rest? It is more than mere bloodlust that sets him apart from the savage masses. It is his selflessness and bravery. But more than that, it is his commitment to his honourable duty. In the Vedic tradition, for example, a man is granted entrance to a warrior's paradise, akin to that of Valhalla or Elysium, if he dies in battle, regardless of his deeds in life. This was because, to the ancient Indo-Europeans, the greatest sin imaginable was to stand by and do nothing as your people fought and died. There is a quote incorrectly attributed to Dante Alighieri, the famous Italian poet and author of The Inferno, that the lowest pits of hell are reserved for those men who, in times of crisis, choose to retain their neutrality. While he didn't actually say or even imply this, and the true source of the quote is unknown, the quote nevertheless accurately summarizes that quintessential Indo-European warrior idea that cowards are worse than villains. Throughout mythology, heroes are men who go out and do their duty, and the Greek legends are a fine example of this. Whether to protect their kinsmen, like Theseus, to protect their family, like Perseus, or to atone for wrongdoings often out of their control, such as Heracles, or Hercules to the modern English speaker. There is a purpose and a sense of duty to these men, who oftentimes step up to meet the challenges of corrupt and cruel tyrants, and overcome whatever odds they face by bravery, might, and divine will. We can, in a way, say that all heroes, whether mythical, purely historical, or a bit of both, were chosen by the gods. In myth, there are men who have their journeys to glory began by order of the gods. In history, we find time and time again the right man in the right place at the right time. If Augustus hadn't have arisen and overcome the trials and tribulations of post-Caesarian Rome, then I would not be speaking to you now, as the Latin alphabet would never have reached my country, and the English language would not exist, with its many influences from the great mother tongues of Europe, Latin, Greek, and of course, German. But equally, if Arminius had not thrown off his Roman bonds and rebelled, then Germanic independence may well have been stamped out for good, and Germany would have become just another Latinized country. And I would likewise not be speaking to you now, as the circumstances for any of our respective births would have never come about, and neither of us would exist. Like the Greek heroes, born in times of dire tragedy, we are born exactly where and when we are needed, even if that doesn't seem to be the case to us. Tragedies of the past have occurred so that even greater empires might rise in the future, and history teaches us that even the greatest maladies of history might have a greater purpose in what the future holds. The hero is an archetype that remains no less fascinating to us in the modern day than it was to our ancestors, though the expression of this fascination is unfortunately very different. For a start, the average modern man lacks any real heroes. His idols are typically useless, vapid celebrities who are being revealed more and more to have engaged in the most sickening acts of depravity. This is not only the case for the average modern consumerist, but our people as a whole. We seem to be severely lacking in heroes as a collective. With all of these recent occurrences across our world, of statues being torn down, we should ask ourselves, Who in the modern era would we build statues of in order to honour their contributions to our people? Very few worthy men come to mind, besides perhaps a very fresh wound for many of us. With the despicable murder of Tommy Lind, a man who stepped up to be counted amongst those few still willing to do their duty to their people, in his brave deeds we can see a hero. And yet, where are our people mourning for him, outside of nationalist circles alone? He did not die for any political belief or nationalist movement. He died doing everything he could to protect our people, and yet many of them they never knew he even existed, and many others more vile treat his most noble sacrifice with scorn and contempt. Clearly, our people are sick in their very souls. It should not fall to a single man to take on the mantle of a hero, but rather it should be a quality alive within any healthy people as a whole. The attitude towards heroes, therefore, needs to become what it once was, and the heroic spirit must be cultivated amongst us as a collective. Men such as Tommy Lind, a man whose name will remain in the hearts of heroes still yet to come, have proven that men of his calibre still exist. It is not the hero that is missing from our blood. We as a people have simply forgotten how to pay due reverence to such heroes as our ancestors had always done. This is due, in no small part, to our own heroes of our people's past having been rendered alien and often childlike to us. The ancient Romans have become seen as either honorary Christians or a multicultural empire of sub-Saharan Africans, the Vikings and Norsemen as irredeemable savages or play pretenders dressed in leather biker gear, and perhaps the Greeks have suffered more than others in the common perception modernists have of their ancestors, with their traditions being given the status of merely quaint fairy tales for children, and their people, along with the Romans, now being hailed by the modern left as hotbeds for homosexuality and degeneracy. This is despite the fact that the Romans held to the Lex Scantinia, which made homosexual advances on a Roman citizen, as well as a Roman citizen voluntarily submitting himself to said advances, punishable by death, exile, or bankruptcy, depending on the severity of the offence. Alexander the Great's mother also feared that he would become like a woman, due to him having more interest in military matters than in having sex as a teenager, going as far as to find him a woman who she deemed suitable. And homosexuality being punished by death under the constitutional laws of Lycurgus of Sparta. Across both Greece and Rome, accusing a rival of being a passive homosexual was the most grievous political slander. A man in adulthood who idolizes the Norsemen or the Greeks, who seeks to embody Hercules or Ragnar, is regarded as childish, and the respective desecration of these figures through modern media portrayals have made it harder than ever to be sincere in your admiration for them. Our gods and our stories have become products to be bought and sold to consumerists who spit on tradition. Those very same consumerists who attack us for seeing the ancient gods and heroes as they were seen by the men who revered them properly, rather than the modernist Disney versions sold to us as quote-unquote history. Our heroes have been replaced with superheroes, also all owned by Disney, which have now become something socially acceptable for young men to not only be interested in, but to shape their entire personality around. If the Inquisition were to return and scour Europe for those guilty of idol worship, they need not look to the pagans, but need look no further than the superhero fan. Where once our ancestors turned to ancient texts for guidance, such as the Romans and the Sibylline books, the modern man likens his struggles to those of his favourite superhero, Star Wars movie, or Harry Potter book. Pop culture has become a religion in and of itself in many ways, and has replaced our traditions in the minds of the masses. Nowhere is this made clearer than in the cult of J.K. Rowling, author of Harry Potter. Her cult is undergoing its first schism, as she has refused to support transgender rights, and her fan base is now tearing itself apart, as if her personal views have somehow tainted their sacred book. I haven't read Harry Potter myself, but I hear that she made all of the bankers small, greedy, beady-eyed, hook-nosed goblins, and I couldn't possibly imagine what her inspiration was on that one. It's also worthy of note that in all of these dumb superhero films, the hero's job is always to work with the government and military-industrial complex, who are always good people with your best interests in mind, in order to maintain the status quo and save it from one of those evil villains who wants to put to right some problem that others refuse to address. Having now dipped my toe into being a media critic, I must digress. Our society as a whole now has an idea of a hero as the complete opposite of what was once the natural and healthy ideals of a strong society. Now the terms hero and victim have become somewhat synonymous. It is not seen as positive now to be a victorious conqueror who imposes his will on the world. It is now only the victim who can be celebrated. One might look at the Native Americans as an example. The Aztecs were a brutal warrior culture that oppressed and conquered their neighboring tribes, taking much delight in subjugating those who surrounded them and sacrificing them to their gods whenever they were victorious. However, when they were conquered by a rival empire, the Spanish under Cortés, who were actually backed up by countless native allies who wished to throw off the yoke of Aztec rule and live under the rule of Cortés, they suddenly became peaceful nomads who could do no wrong in the eyes of the modern man looking back on history. One conquering European empire had triumphed over a conquering Native American one, so clearly morality cannot factor into the situation. And yet still it is wrong to celebrate the conquering Europeans, only the natives who lost the war. We can see the same attitude when looking at the Zulu, who had expanded out of Zululand and into what is now South Africa, moving further and further out in their territorial conquests. In their expansion, they took many slaves, often cannibalizing them, subjecting the real natives of the land to barbarous cruelty. This expansion brought them head-to-head with another expanding empire, the British, and a brutal war ensued, ending in British victory. Once again, two expansionist empires meet, and one can only celebrate the so-called victim, rather than the victorious conquerors. Returning to the Indo-Europeans, the hero is often either in a position of leadership or later has this position bestowed upon him for his deeds. It is fitting, therefore, for us to begin looking into two of the three key ranks of the ancient Indo-Europeans, those being the chieftain and the warrior. The Indo-European chieftain was expected to embody the virtues of the other high castes, having roles as generals and leaders on the battlefield, most often on the front lines in their chariots or cavalry. When off the battlefield, not only was he expected to govern his tribe politically, he was also to undertake the most sacred rites and religious duties, and provide feasts to his people in honor of the gods. This position was so important that when the Romans threw out their last king and vowed to stay as a republic, they still kept the position of the Rex Sacrorum, or sacred king, but just removed all of the senatorial political power that came with the position, as these kingly religious duties still had to be performed. As we discussed in our first episode, the Nordic rig, cognate of the Latin rex through the Indo-European word regs, was also a sacred king appointed by Balder himself, and shown the secret rites of the runes, so that he might both govern his people and revere the gods in the proper manner. In fact, contrary to popular opinion, very few Norsemen could read the runes. Only the truly worthy were initiated into this most ancient of traditions. This wasn't uncommon. Literacy rates across all ancient societies was very low, The literacy rate of the Romans was unparalleled for centuries and only reached around 10% of the empire's population. This was not by any means down to the general populations of Europe being stupid, but rather the fact that education was an incredibly expensive ordeal, and writing was regarded as both a magical and a creative art form, and only those who were truly worthy could be initiated into such traditions. Even now, when the Norse runes are more popular than they may have ever been, it is one thing to read them, it is another thing entirely to understand them. Only those who truly learn from them, those who are gifted the knowledge of the gods bestowed upon them by wise men who had been likewise initiated. The word rune itself actually translates to hidden mystery or secret, and like the name, the runes themselves are hiding something in plain sight. Therefore, we can see that throughout both early and later Indo-European societies, the initiation of a leader was incredibly important, and a chieftain would have to gain the favour of both his men and his gods before taking on the role of both the ruler and the high priest, bridging the gap between the mortal and the divine. This meant that the order of the tribe was divinely ordained, and even politics was a religious affair, something apparent in later Indo-European societies. I am more fearful of an army of sheep led by a lion than an army of lions led by a sheep, so said one of the most famous leaders of all time, and a true embodiment of both a warrior and a leader, Alexander. He, in his earlier years, was the embodiment of a true Indo-European chieftain, and yet in his later years, before his death, may well have almost led his people into cultural and ethnic extinction, adopting the customs and women of the very people he and his men had conquered, while forsaking his own, and demanding his men do the same. A man such as Alexander is worthy of wider discussion, but for now he serves well as an archetype. As we have just mentioned, the three main castes of the Indo-European societies were the chieftain, the warrior, and the priest castes, and the ideal leader has historically embodied all three to differing degrees. Throughout both myth and history, we see the warrior become king and rule with a just and righteous, but often ambitious hand. We can look to Caesar, Arminius, Ragnar and Horsa for examples, all of whom were cut down before their time, with both Caesar and Arminius, along with Romulus and many others, being betrayed by the jealous noblemen of their own peoples. When the ancients talk of these mythological figures who rose to greatness against all odds with the blessings of the gods, these tales should not be treated as mere stories. As we see time and time again, these same archetypes arise across all Indo-European peoples. Whether you believe that these stories have been embellished or not is up to you, though these embellishments are usually esoteric in nature. The only reason that we as a people view the tales of men like Romulus and Ragnar as childish myths and fantasies, but the tales of Caesar and Eric the Red as historical fact, is because modern historians and their Marxist materialist interpretation of history have removed any of the spiritual elements of the lives of these great men and relegated any sense of the divine that they could not erase to myth and fairy tale, despite the deeds of these historic men being oftentimes less believable to modern ears than any mythological event. A logical mind, and I dare say even a purely materialistic one, should be far more inclined to believe the story of Ragnar, a Norse warrior becoming a king and going out to foreign lands to raid and conquer, like many Norsemen did, than they are to believe that Alexander and his men were dying of dehydration in the desert, and after praying to the gods for water, two ravens, messengers of the gods, appeared above him and circled around his head before flying off. Alexander followed these ravens, who led him to an oasis, where his men could finally drink. The first of these is myth, the second is history, and the bias of the modern academic historian is very clear. One common occurrence amongst Indo-Europeans that prevailed throughout the different places they travelled to, long after they had differentiated themselves, was that of a warrior aristocracy who were fanatically religious in their every undertaking. Every physical action that they took, whether on the battlefield, the parade ground, or anywhere else for that matter, they were steeped in tradition and spirituality. The ancient Aryans believed that glory in warfare was the greatest way to please the gods and earn immortality. The earliest piece of Indo-European artwork we have, crafted sometime around 3000 BC, is known as the Kurnovisky idol. It depicts a bearded man surrounded by bows, clubs, axes, and other weapons. He is completely naked besides from his belt, implying that heroic nudity was an Indo-European concept in art depicting warriors for a very long time. As Nietzsche famously said, a god should be ashamed of his clothes. As we said in our first episode, the controversial term Aryan derives from the ancient Indo-European word for kinsman and became a mark of nobility, as only those descended from the conquering warriors would refer to one another as kinsmen, and thus this term came into use amongst the lower, subjugated peoples to refer to their overlords. These men were, by nature of their conquest, members of the warrior caste, and their establishment as an elite would remain amongst Indo-European peoples for centuries. In Rome, you could not become a politician without first having served a substantial career in the military, and the tales of Nordic kings like Harald Hardrada are full of warrior nobles who led from the front. This has obviously changed in the modern day, with politicians now being extremely wealthy through dubious means and recruiting mostly the poor to go and fight their wars for them. Because of this modern take, many now assume that this has always been the case, and that the words nobility and aristocracy are synonymous with greedy and cowardly and soft, is that this was not always the case, at least not for our ancient ancestors. For example, in the Roman Republic before the Marian reforms, only the landowning middle and upper classes were permitted to even serve in the army, and a man had to have a military career in order to become a politician. The Celts likewise had a strict caste system led by a chariot and later cavalry-mounted nobility. Only the richest of the Celts would be able to afford an ingenious Celtic invention: chainmail. Chainmail is expensive enough to produce even now with mechanized industry, and so mail was a mark of incredibly high status amongst Celtic culture. Amongst the Greeks, the Spartans were the most obvious and extreme examples of a warrior aristocracy, with all Spartans being equal amongst themselves, trained as both living weapons as well as adept philosophers and musicians, though these aspects of their society are rarely explored or depicted in popular culture. Athenians too, however, were all called to serve their country in its time of need. Some well-known men who are now less well-known for their military exploits include Socrates and Plato, and the Athenians were directed in military matters by 10 noblemen called the strategoi, such as Miltiades and Themistocles, who led the Athenians to victory against the Persians. Amongst the Norse and Germanic peoples, we hear time and time again throughout both myth and history of the warrior nobility of the Nordic peoples. Before becoming kings, the well-known Norse heroes were fierce warriors, a tradition that continued for some time even after their conversion to Christianity. These men were sought after as bodyguards since the times of Julius Caesar, who surrounded himself with Germanic cavalrymen, who he would personally lead in his famous cavalry charge against the Gauls at the Battle of Alesia. This initially somewhat informal mercenary organization would later evolve into the more standardized force known as the numerus batavorum, due to their recruitment mainly stemming from the Germanic tribe known as the Batavi, though other Germanic tribes such as the Frisiae and Ubii would also join. This bodyguard unit would be maintained by the entire Julio-Claudian dynasty, owing to their skill and fierce, unwavering loyalty, contrasted to the infamous, often treacherous and politically motivated Praetorian Guards. Even the most famous client king of all time, Herod of Judea, employed a Germanic bodyguard, attempting to emulate the system that had worked very well for the Roman Emperor Augustus. While these men are not exactly examples of a political nobility, they seem to routinely develop from a class of foreign mercenaries into a fiercely loyal and very skillful caste of warriors, consistently kept separate from the general population, as we see happening the exact same way with the later Varangian guards of the Byzantine Empire. However, the idea of heroism was as much about an individual being prepared to do his duty no matter the cost, as much as it was about being ruled by a collective made up of these individuals. The heroic spirit must exist in a people as a collective if they are to thrive, but even amongst cultures like the Norsemen, wherein heroism is ingrained into the very fabric of everything they did, individuals can still be seen rising up to impossible odds. The tale of the Battle of Stamford Bridge is an excellent example of just how vital these lone warrior heroes were to Indo-European peoples. For 15 minutes, a single Viking held off up to 20,000 Saxons by meeting them at a bridge. It was only by sailing under the bridge in a barrel and stabbing him in the groin that this Norseman was brought down. A related custom of self-sacrifice that I would like to mention is that of the Roman devotio, from which we get our term devotion. The devotio was an act of superhuman courage performed by a handful of Roman generals over the years. The devotio was a ritual undertaken by the leading general of an army, who would have the priests anoint him as a sacrifice to Jupiter and Mars in order to grant his people victory. After their anointment, the general would ride up and down the Roman lines, proclaiming his intentions to the soldiers serving under him. He would then plunge himself into certain death so that his own self-sacrifice would grant his people the favour of the gods. One such event occurred during the Battle of Sentinum in 293 BC, during which the Romans were fighting against the Etruscans, Samnites, and Gauls simultaneously. During this battle, the Roman general Publius Decius Mus, whose own father had also performed a devotio in the decades before, was faced with a military disaster. His cavalry had been pushed back by Gallic chariots and crashed into his own infantry lines, routing the Roman soldiers and risking total annihilation at the hands of the Gauls and Samnites. Realizing that his time had come to follow in his father's footsteps, he had himself anointed by the priests and then rode up and down the Roman lines, delivering his final words. "I carry before me terror, rout, carnage, blood, and the wrath of all the gods, those above and below. I shall infect the standards, the armour, the weapons of the enemy with dire and manifold death. The place of my destruction shall also witness that of the Gauls and Samnites." He then leapt into the thickest part of the enemy line, wherein the enemy threw javelins at him, cutting him down. Appearing before the Roman soldiers was the Lupus Martius, the Wolf of Mars, a sign that the gods had accepted his sacrifice. Seeing this, the routing Romans reformed and pushed back the Gallic and Samnite lines. The battle was eventually won against all odds. His father before him, of the same name, had performed a similar rite during the Latin Wars, sacrificing himself by plunging into the enemy lines. He was said to have fought with such supernatural vigour that he single-handedly forced the enemy to fall back and slay him with javelins from a distance, and then reform their ranks. There were, of course, other devotios that were performed, but these were the most well-known examples. For a man to disregard his own life and plunge himself into certain death in order for his people to win victory, his courage and his reverence of the gods granting him and his people eternal glory, he made the ultimate sacrifice, when he easily could have fled and returned to Rome, retiring on the riches that a general's wage provided. It is one thing to risk death, another thing to accept death, but another thing still to charge towards the enemy with the intention of dying, in order for the gods to grant your men victory. Such occurrences like this pose questions for the Marxist ideas of history, in which all things are done for material gains, and the rich exploit the poor, using religion as an opium of the masses. What material gains did Publius Decius Mus make from being dismembered by spears? It also shows that those who claim that the ancients were not truly religious at all and saw things only as metaphors for natural phenomena cannot be entirely correct. It is also thought that there was a very specific rite of passage for all young men in Indo-European societies, one that is known today as a manabund. In order for boys to become men, they would have to join up into a band of young men of similar ages. Half of the year would be spent working as farmhands, the other half as raiders, going out into foreign territory and plundering the lands, earning fame and fortune. This way they would learn all that they needed to embody the masculine ideal, to tend and care and protect as farmers, and to fight and struggle and forage as warriors. This also might be why the god of war also had agricultural associations, such as Mars for the Romans, or the warrior god Thor for the Norse. During these years, these men would wear the skins of animals, thus giving rise to the wolf pelts of the Ulfhednir in Nordic tradition, and the werlites and achillifers of the Romans. The famous Spartan agoge also appears to be an extension of this ancient rite of passage, though the agoge was far more formalized, while still retaining many elements of this custom, including time spent outside of society, being forced to learn how to forage and live off the land, etc. The Italic peoples also maintained this custom, calling it the vir sacrum, and it was held in very high regard, especially by both Samnites and Sabines alike. This was a practice in which young unmarried men would be initiated into a warband and go out to plunder or conquer enemy settlements, much as the ancient Aryans had been doing for millennia. It is thought that the legendary first king of Rome, Romulus, who was first outcast from his home as the son of a Vestal virgin and raised by a she-wolf, then voluntarily leaving his life as a shepherd, was quite possibly undertaking this rite of passage. Once he had fought and plundered enough, waging war against the usurper Amulius, he then decided to build his own city and open it up to other quote-unquote outcasts, who are almost all given as being young unmarried men, the exact demographic who would be undertaking this same rite of passage. The myth of Romulus is steeped in esoteric meaning, but we cannot explore it without approaching wider Indo-European myths of creation and the founding of peoples, which will be covered in a later episode. Obviously, this similarity of the vir sacrum with the Nordic Ulfhednir and Viking raiding bands is evident, even down to wearing the same animal pelts. In fact, the werlites, the youngest members of the Roman army during the Republican period, were also known to wear little to no armour and be draped in wolf pelts, possibly as a continuation of this ancient religious tradition, being reshaped so as to accommodate the Romans' new approach to conquest and colonies in the Republican period. Wolf and bear pelts later became an honorific distinction amongst achillifers, bearers of the golden eagle standards of Jupiter. This idea of a religious warrior champion being dressed in the skin of a wolf or bear retains its distinction amongst both Romans and Nordics, two people who are often thought of being from different worlds. Of course, talking about all of these warrior traditions would not be complete without us talking of the hero's paradise. As many will know, there are many afterlives within Indo-European religions, and access to each is granted depending on the actions one performs in life. This is both most clear and most well known within the Norse religion, with the idea of Valhalla, a warrior's paradise in which heroes go to drink and feast, fighting and training for the final battle at the end of the world. Valhalla is of course very well known in popular culture, arguably the most well known of all Norse afterlives, and the reason for that is simple. Even in this modern day, with its wage slavery and its Marxist materialistic ideas of history, there is still something within Valhalla that still speaks to our very souls as Europeans. Not necessarily Valhalla itself specifically, but the idea that our fallen heroes reside in paradise, a cut above all other mortal men. Even with the horrors of the last two great wars of the 20th century, our hearts yearn not only for a place in this hero's paradise for ourselves, but more so for our ancestors. In fact, I would argue that the idea of an eternal paradise is, in many ways, less appealing than to live on in glory amongst one's descendants, and to have one's mortal memory become immortal throughout the histories. The Greek and Roman afterlives can be somewhat complicated, as many of the ancients disagreed as to its nature. However, we may put this down to the innumerable philosophers of the time speculating on the myths to find the answers, each often coming to his own conclusion. However, we may say that the notion of death in battle for one's people was of the utmost importance, whether or not there was some glorious afterlife promised to those who fell. Take the words of the magnificent Homer, when he says in different parts throughout the Iliad, "Without a sign, his sword the brave man draws, and asks no omen but his country's cause. Any moment might be our last. Everything is more beautiful because we are doomed. You will never be lovelier than you are now. We will never be here again. Let me not then die ingloriously and without a struggle, but let me first do some great thing that shall be told amongst men hereafter." Couple this with the Roman poet Horace's immortal line of poetry, "Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori." It is a sweet and glorious thing to die for the fatherland. And you'll see easily that the concept of a warrior's paradise reserved for those who met a glorious end in the defense of their peoples permeates throughout Indo-Europeans. Interestingly enough, even the Old Testament seems to imply that there is a special part of the afterlife reserved for fallen warriors from amongst the uncircumcised. It says that the sons of Japheth fell in battle. This is, I believe, a copy of the ancient Greek tradition in which they thought of themselves as the descendants of the Titan Japetus, both originally being pronounced Iapetos and Iapeth, an obvious transliteration from the Greek into the Semitic word. Japheth is, to the biblical Jews, thought to be the forefather of the European peoples, as opposed to Shem of the Shemites and Ham of the Africans. But, as we will tackle in a later episode, this is ultimately derived from the Greek myth of Ouranos and Kronos. However, there seems to be a contempt for fallen warriors in general, with only two sons of Japheth being spared from eternal damnation. In Ezekiel chapter 32, verse 22, we can read, "Assyria is there with her whole army. She is surrounded by the graves of all her slain, all who have fallen by the sword. Their graves are in the depths of the pit, and her army lies around her grave. All who had spread terror in the land of the living are fallen, slain by the sword. Elam is there, with all her hordes around her grave. All of them are slain, fallen by the sword. all who had spread terror in the land of the living went down uncircumcised to the earth below. They bear their shame for those who go down to the pit. A bed is made for her amongst the slain, with all her hordes spread around her grave. All of them are uncircumcised, killed by the sword. Because their terror had spread in the land of the living, they bear their shame with those who go down to the pit. They are laid among the slain. Meshech and Tubal, sons of Japheth, are there, with all their hordes around their graves. All of them are uncircumcised, killed by the sword because they spread their terror in the land of the living. But they do not lie with the mighty men, the fallen ones, the warriors of old, who went down to Sheol, the Semitic equivalent of the Greek Hades, meaning a general underworld, with their weapons of war, their swords placed under their heads and their shields resting on their bones, though these warriors also had terrorized the land of the living. You too, Pharaoh, will be broken and will lie among the uncircumcised, with those killed by the sword. Edom is there, her kings and all her princes. Despite their power, they are laid with those killed by the sword. They lie with the uncircumcised, with those who go down to the pit. All the princes of the north and all of the Sidonians are there. They went down with the slain in disgrace, despite the terror caused by their power. They lie uncircumcised with those killed by the sword, and bear their shame for those who will go down to the pit. For I spread terror in the land of the living, and he shall be laid to rest among the uncircumcised, with those who are slain by the sword, Pharaoh and all his multitude, declares Yahweh. Now, the original term for fallen ones, referring specifically to uncircumcised gentile warriors who died in battle, was Nephilim, a word that may be somewhat familiar for some of you, but that's a whole other rabbit hole for a whole other episode. It would seem to imply that, other than these two, Meshech and Tubal, nephews of Shem, progenitor of the Semitic race, that the gentile warriors get their own special place in the afterlife, for better or worse. The idea of this specific afterlife, be it Valhalla or Elysium, somewhere in which the fallen warriors might reside, is emblematic of how these warriors were seen in their own days, and even in ours to this day. After all, no one can imagine Ivar the Boneless in heaven nor hell, nor men such as Romulus or Alexander, who would all surely grow bored without anything in which they might struggle against and conquer. And to imagine such men burning in an eternal pit of torture is an equally disturbing thought. If men who had conquered the known world can end up in a pit of torture for all eternity despite their glory, then what chance does the normal man stand? In our hearts, no matter what kind of veneer we wish to place over it, we mortal men will only ever see our fallen heroes as a cut above the rest, including even ourselves. There will always be a place in our hearts, our folklore, and our myth for the hero, and the glory of the hero is better than any heaven. As Evola put it best, the blood of the heroes is closer to God than the ink of the scribes or the prayers of the faithful.
I really enjoyed your script, Taerus, always digging forth fascinating historical details and with great understanding and insight of our people's myths and mentality. I would like to begin by taking up the story of this legendary historical figure of the Hellenic antiquity, Alexander the Great, because he combines many of the subjects you talked about and he's relevant to our episode. I can't say I agree on how you describe his late years and the potential outcome of his actions on his people, but this is not an episode about him, so I'll try to be short. He was a member of the royal Macedonian war aristocracy, a prince that became a king and died an emperor, and whose conquest paved the way for the future empire building of the Aryans, mainly realized by the Romans. Alexander the Great combined some specific qualities that make him an archetype, a model of a chieftain in its highest form, that is a king and a hero, with all that it means to be a hero. He was the embodiment of a force of history and the embodiment of the unstoppable will of his people. And what do I mean by that? Alexander the Great lived and died in the 4th century BC, and for at least 200 years before that, the Hellenic world, the classical world, was continuously harassed and threatened by the Persian Empire. These two historical colossus met and crashed for the first time in those years. And despite the romanticized picture of the Persian Empire many have, and which to some extent is true, it was an Aryan aristocracy leading a multicultural and multiracial army, and the Greeks saw them as tyrannical barbarians, as an inferior civilization, and as an enemy that has been neutralized. And this is important for my argument.
I believe that there were even Greek mercenaries fighting for the Persians, and when Alexander was victorious over them, he had them all executed for treachery against Greece, granting absolutely no mercy at all to anyone who had abandoned and betrayed their fatherland.
Yeah, that's true, absolutely. And the years between 600 and 300 BC, the Greeks were in their climax, at their highest points of the cycle of their civilization. Strong, brave, creative, artistic, wise, warlike, and expanding, seeking new colonies, taking up every challenge they met with, seeking new living space for them, as every civilization does in its highest period. The Persians were an active threat to them, and 150 years before Alexander, the Persians attacked mainland Greece and almost succeeded into eradicating that civilization. And it was at those so-called by the Greeks Persian wars that the Greeks, with the Athenians and especially the Spartans in the front line, stepped forth into history and showed what they were worth with all their glory and became legends. The 5th century BC Persian Wars, that is, the Persian invasion of mainland Greece, was won by the Greeks, but the threat of the Persian Empire was still there, active and overhanging.
Yeah, after the heroic, legendary battles of Thermopylae, Salamis and Marathon, the Persians realized that they could never hope to defeat the mighty combined arms of the Greeks, so instead began an old, familiar and most un-Aryan tactic. They started buying up corrupt officials amongst the ranks of both the Athenians and the Spartans, and they deepened the mending wedge that had formed between these brother Greeks and began financing both sides in wars against one another, using trickery and dishonor to bring about a series of brother wars, essentially, until Alexander managed to unify all of Hellas under his banner and stamped out the foreign interference of the Persians for good.
Yeah, exactly. Now, if we look further, Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle, and he studied under Aristotle during his youth. And Aristotle was heavily influenced by Plato, which made Alexander a bearer of the Platonic ideas and ideals. Now, besides the differences to some extent of the philosophical ideas between these two great thinkers, Plato and Aristotle, they both agreed and declared one important thing, that the Greeks should rule over the Persians, as they saw themselves superior collectively and individually in spirit, mind, and body, and because the threat from the east should be neutralized permanently if they were to continue with their way of life. Alexander strongly believed on the superiority of the Hellenic civilization to the Persian, and he carried that conviction throughout his life. Now, these philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, were not only abstract thinkers beyond their time, beyond their place, and beyond their people. They were not philosophizing for the benefit of an undefined humanity. They were racial and especially a national voice. In their works, the high philosophical spirit of classical Hellenism found its expression, a spirit of a specific people, of a specific race, that manifested through their ideas and teachings.
Yeah, interestingly enough, the Washington Post has done our work for us, and they even went as far as to call Aristotle the father of scientific racism in an article we'll obviously provide in our further reading section. And Aristotle's work, The Politics, contains quite a telling quote. The natives of Asia, which obviously include the Persians, are wanting in spirit, and therefore they are always in a state of subjection and slavery.
Yeah, a historical truth. So this idea and proposal that the Greeks should rule over the barbarians, the Persians, became a reality about 20 years after Plato's death. The historical necessity for the Hellenic people of the classical era, that is the neutralization of the threat of the Persian Empire, was realized by Alexander the Great, who became thus an active force of history, an embodiment of the collective will of the Greeks, a king who implemented his people's destiny. And destiny, as a superior divine principle, was in Alexander the Great's case more evident than any other time in the history of the Hellenic civilization. When his body was examined after his death, his generals were amazed by the number of injuries he had on him. His whole body was covered by old wounds, scars, and healed lacerations. And the number of wounds was in accordance to his life as a warrior and his actions as a military leader. Always in the front line, always in the heat of the battle, in the middle of the bloodshed and the slaughter, leading his soldiers and comrades by example. According to a story given to us by Arrian, during a siege of a fortified castle in Sogdian, he was leading the charge, and as he was climbing first on the ladder in order to breach the walls, the defenders of the walls managed to throw the ladder away just as Alexander jumped and landed upon the walls, leaving him completely alone amidst the enemy. Now his soldiers panicked and with superhuman efforts climbed the ladders again, breaking every resistance, and came to him after some time only to find him still fighting off the enemies, high up on the wall, all by himself, and thanks to the gods, still alive. And this is my point. Alexander the Great could have fallen in any of the numerous battles he participated, by any of the countless blows he received in his long campaign, but he didn't. The modern rational intellect, blind to the realities of the world, would appoint that to luck. No, it was destiny that kept him alive, a principle prior and beyond the personified deities that helps regulate and sustain the order and the balance of the world, and whose ways are for us most often a mystery. There is no luck in the world as meant by the modern man, as a faceless, meaningless, and randomly acting force of good or evil, with no identity, with no purpose, to which the modern intellect appoints events in life that it cannot otherwise explain, or events which question the fragile foundations of his limited worldview. To our ancestors, what most people call luck today was the expression of the will of the gods, a higher, timeless, form-giving principle that chooses to participate in the timeline of history in order to sustain the order and the balance of the world. And this force, call it destiny if you will, protected Alexander the Great until his great task was complete, until his potentiality was realized and his purpose was fulfilled, granting him status and glory that forever will inspire anyone who has still a fighting sparkle left in him. Alexander the Great and his Dorian Macedonians proudly put their origins to Zeus and Hercules, And by the gods, it's difficult to question that. His accomplishment, his short but intense passing in the world, was a Herculean task, guided and protected by divine forces. Alexander the Great was a historical person, a man that became a hero and later worshipped as a demigod in a hero cult like no other in history before or ever since. A legend whose memory is still, today, vivid in folk traditions. And how many heroes, real persons or mythological from antiquity, can claim such an honor? He was the embodiment of a force of history who realized the destiny of a whole people and himself transcended by his virtue and actions into the realm of legend, only saved for a few chosen ones.
Julius Caesar, possibly one of the few men in history with a legacy comparable to that of Alexander, while in his late 20s, looked upon a statue of Alexander and reportedly broke down into tears. When asked why he was crying, the young Caesar remarked, "By the time this man was my age, he had conquered the known world, and yet I have done nothing." This mere statue of Alexander was said to be what sparked the ambition of some of the mightiest men of European history. That is the kind of effect that Alexander's eternal legacy has had on Europe.
Yes. Now, I would like to move further to another aspect of the conflicts between the Greeks and the Persians at this specific historical period, which is more practically relevant to our struggle on the realm of politics today. And it is the timeline of the unfolding events, how history took a whole different direction and granted total victory to the Greeks, however hopeless and dire their situation was a few generations ago. Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire within 4 years from the beginning of his campaign, officially the year 330 BC, with the sack of Persepolis. Now, at 480 BC, when the Persian troops were burning Athens to the ground during the Persian invasion of Greece, who of the Athenian sailors upon Themistocles' fleet, watching the thick cloud of black smoke rising over the city of Athens, who of them could ever imagine that 150 years later a Greek army would sack and burn the capital of their arch-enemy, the greatest and most powerful fighting force of the time? Probably no one. And this is one of the countless examples showing that the course of history is unpredictable and dynamic, and has taught us one thing: that the least expected, the least possible outcome at a specific time can be the reality of the future. And similarly, in our struggle today, the outer political struggle, our enemy may seem invincible and all-powerful, but the forces of history are even more powerful, unstoppable, when they build up momentum. And these forces, this dynamic, acting primarily on the metaphysical plane, need to find expression on the physical plane, in history and politics. Expression through groups and personalities who become themselves the living embodiment of a force of history and implement the destiny of their people. These groups and personalities are not part of the masses, they are not the public, they are not passive observants of the dynamic of the world around them. On the contrary, they are awakened, heroic men and women with insight, with will to act and stand their ground. And they stand as unmovable pillars, and upon them the chaotic flow of history crashes and changes course to the direction they indicate. They are the catalysts of history, and they may live and act in a specific time, but their qualities are timeless. They are heroic, the highest degree of excellence a human may ever achieve. I wish today to speak more about heroism and the heroic aspect of life from our ancestors' perspective and what value it may have for us today. In the traditional Aryan civilization, heroism was the most valuable and praiseworthy character or a status a man may have. The idea of heroism and the archetype of the hero was so central in the Aryan cultures that granted them a nearly divine status and a very own worship, the hero cult. A hero could be the progenitor of a tribe who becomes a subject and the central character of the founding legends of a tribe. He is of divine descent and becomes a bridge between the people and the gods. This connection may have been used by the people of the tribe in order to claim superiority and strength, and even understood by many today as tactical and a political statement. But in reality, it has to do with the most fundamental axiom and characteristic of the traditional cultures of our ancestors. The fact that our ancestors thought themselves to be connected and attuned to the eternal world, beyond the human, the mortal, and the physical reality. They knew that our world is regulated by higher forces and principles that act beyond the rational perception of the restricted human intellect, and they clearly claimed their origins from that eternal higher source. And similarly, while the chieftain king was believed to be the bridge maker, the pontifex between the people and the realm of the divine, the one who incorporates and maintains the continuity of this connection in real historical time, the divine progenitor was the source of this bond.
Claiming descent from the gods is a uniquely Indo-European trait, as Herodotus in his work The Histories talks about a dark-skinned Egyptian priest arguing with a Greek man, whose name escapes me, for claiming descent from the gods, saying that such a thing was impossible and arrogant and all sorts of other insults. And the Greek responds by just listing his family tree. It's quite an entertaining story.
Yeah, they took a great pride in it, I can tell you that. And I remember still now when the mythological heroes, right, or heroes from the Iliad, they met on the battlefield, and then they realized that they actually somehow not related, but they had they explained their family trees, and then they saw that some of their ancestors used to be friends. So they left the fight, they stopped fighting, and instead they exchanged gifts and continued this friendship. So it was very, very important for them. Now, the heroic progenitors were not only demigods of a distant mythological tradition like Hercules and Theseus. The tradition lived on in historical times with historical individuals. The founder of a colony, for example, will be cremated after his death, and his bones would be buried in the agora, the central square, and then he would be praised, honored and worshipped as a pioneer colonizer in a hero cult of his own. His relics, his bones, would be the colony's most valuable possession, and in case of a catastrophic emergency where the city had to be abandoned, the people would dig out the bones and take them with them, even many generations after, because they saw the founder of the colony as a protector, as an integral part of the soul of the city, and as a connection to the eternal reality. In South Europe, the custom of digging out the bones of the ancestors from the graveyard of the village and carrying them with when the village had to be abandoned because of war or persecution survived until the 20th century, a folkish tradition that withstood the test of time and even the change of religion, which vividly proves that sacred traditions are rooted in the folkish soul much deeper than superficial religious beliefs, and act as a bond between the mysterious realm of the collective subconscious of a people and the higher and timeless reality of the world. You mentioned Herodotus. He made a famous classification of beings, with the gods on top, then the demons, the heroes and the humans. He appointed to the heroes an age of their own, the heroic age, as we said in our last episode, a heroic renaissance, a heroic revitalization of the Aryans before the coming of the Iron Age. Those great warriors were immortalized in the Greco-Roman traditions, and their glorious superhuman characters and deeds were sung by the greatest poets of all, the divine Homer. Heroes like Odysseus, Achilles, Ajax, and many others personified the most fundamental characters of the Greeks, both good and bad, with their virtues and their flaws. And similarly, of course, did the heroes of all the Aryan nations. And these great mythological and folkish heroes were believed to be present in all the great historical battles, crises, and triumphs of their respective people. For example, the warriors of the Hellenic tribe Lokri always left an empty place in their military formation, their phalanx, a place believed to be occupied by Ajax, the great mythological hero and progenitor, as he was thought to actively and decisively participate in that battle. So somehow the heroes were always left to be more near the people, more real, more tangible, where gods can be distant. They were role models and paradigms within the reach of the mortal man, personified ideals attainable for the soldier of the front line. And the unforgettable phrase of Themistocles after the decisive destruction of the Persian fleet in Salamis comes to mind. He said, "It's not our deed, but that of our gods and heroes." Heroes in the Aryan traditions were not only warriors, and heroism was not exclusively connected to glorious deeds of war. Asclepius, for example, he was a hero and a god of medicine in ancient Greco-Roman traditions. He was the son of Apollo, an immortal woman, Coronis, and worshipped in a hero cult of his own. And similarly, Lycurgus, the great lawmaker of Sparta, was also worshipped in a hero cult. And despite the lack of certainty regarding his life from the sources, if he was an actual person or not, he was not thought to be a god or a demigod. And it was his institutional reforms that transformed Sparta from an unimportant Dorian colony into a city where the greatest and most fundamental characters and virtues of the Aryans were crystallized in a state whose heroic, manly, and aristocratic character will echo in eternity and forever stand as a guiding light and a standard of Aryan excellence and polemic virtue. Another example of heroism, worshipped in its own local hero cult, was that of Penelope. Yes, the wise, virtuous, and loyal wife of Odysseus, who patiently waited for him for 20 years, pushing back the notorious and aggressive suitors who wanted to marry her and take Odysseus' kingdom in his absence. Penelope, who revered her husband and fulfilled her duties as a wife, a mother, and a queen with a heroic sense of self-sacrifice and commitment, and was immortalized into a symbol of fidelity and piety, and into an ideal of the true original principle of femininity, as seen from our ancestors' perspective, that of a woman honoring her husband, becoming a guardian of her husband's honor, and dedicating herself to her children and her family.
It said that in Sparta, only men who died in battle and women who died in childbirth were allowed to have their names written on their tombstones, because these were seen as the only way to live for the folk.
Oh yes, and generally Sparta is a gigantic chapter of the Aryan history, and we promise our listeners that we'll return to Sparta in a future episode.
Definitely.
Now, our ancestors recognized and praised the heroic ethos, not only in battlefields, wars, and perilous adventures, but also in accomplishments and characters where the individual transcends itself and becomes an embodiment of a superior and timeless value or principle, where the individual becomes an authentic expression of morality, of loyalty, of honor, of duty, of true masculinity or femininity, of self-sacrifice for the people, or an expression of a creative force that benefits the people. The thousand faces of heroism that grant the individual the status of a demigod, not only symbolically, but actually, as the hero becomes the incarnated, living expression of an immortal and timeless idea. Heroes also play a vital role in the process of ethnogenesis, and specifically in the creation of a national idea and identity based upon a founding myth, which is absolutely essential for building a traditional, organic nation-state. In the Aryan cultures, the examples of founding myths based on epic war efforts, revolts, revolutions, and bloody conflicts are countless, always with heroes on the epicenter, whose epic struggle and heroic death become legendary and act as a catalyst for the creation of the national identity, and whose memory, and to some extent worship, vigilantly preserve the national idea. Now this process is activated in every conflict and war a community of people find themselves in. It's not a relic of the past. On the contrary, it's a dynamic process of history, manifested by and concentrated upon the explosive struggle and death of the hero. An example of this process is taking place right now in Eastern Europe at the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Despite the geopolitical correlations, the fragile balance of forces, the complicated, known and secret political processes, and even conspiracies, despite the tension in the history of these two folks, despite even how we, the outsiders, see and understand the conflict, or how the people dragged in it experience it, there are now heroic young soldiers, volunteers, who fight and fall on both sides, and buried and praised as heroes in their towns and villages. The heroic sacrifice of these young patriots is contributing enormously in strengthening and revitalizing the national identity and idea of both sides. And the blood spilled quickens and stimulates the vitality and polemic vigor of both nations. And both nations, regardless of the outcome and the implications of the conflict, will come out of this war healthier, more vital, and more robust. And the study of history shows that periods of war and conflict are necessary in order to sustain the strength and vitality of a nation. Conflict, struggle, and destruction and death are integral and fundamental principles and realities of the order of the world, in the metaphysical, timeless, and unconditional realm, in the grand scale of the universe, in nature, and of course in the human condition, both physical and spiritual. They are the necessary processes which precede creation, regeneration, rejuvenation, birth and life in the eternal rotation of the cosmic cycles. And thus, war is one expression in the human reality of the eternal principle and idea of struggle. The great pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus left us an immortal dictum that will forever shatter the pacifistic hallucinations of the cowards and the ignorants. He said, "War is the father of all and the king of all, and some he made gods and some humans, some he made slaves and some free."
I'd like to reinforce your point regarding war being not only a fact of life but an essential and revitalizing force within a people. In a future episode, we'll no doubt tackle some of the foundational myths of European nations, and I challenge you to find one nation born out of peace and harmony, or was ever destroyed by being too warlike, only not warlike enough. The Roman Empire collapsed partially due to its people abandoning their gods and traditions, but also their martial spirit and prowess, the word martial literally meaning of Mars. The Romans considered themselves the sons of Mars, and both the famous founders of Rome, Aeneas and Romulus, were demigods who fought bitterly to give life to a glorious new nation. The Celts, Germanics, Romans and Greeks were all in perpetual states of warfare from their very beginnings. One need only look at the history of Britain to get a sense of how warfare forges a nation. From the first Indo-European invasion, in which almost all of the Neolithic Britons were wiped out, to the invasion of Celtic Britain by the Romans, followed by the Germanic conquests of the Anglos, Jutes and Saxons after the Roman Empire collapsed, to the invasion of the great heathen army under the heroic tactical genius, the semi-mythical Ivar the Boneless, before another Viking invasion from those who had settled in Ireland. Then you have countless civil wars and conquests within the British Isles itself, before the wars with France began and the beginning of colonialism and an empire spread throughout the world, modelled on Roman imperial ideas and Germanic warrior blood. This tiny island once ruled much of the known world. The tragic brother wars of the early 20th century, however, had seen Britain grow tired and weary of war, and eventually committed itself to spreading peace and freedom throughout the world. It took out a loan to free every slave in the empire, a loan so huge that the British taxpayer only finished paying it back in 2014. So the British taxpayers alive today have paid for the freedom of the slaves. Within a single lifetime, Britain went from holding near total dominion over the world to British people being a minority in their own capital. Through centuries of warfare, the Neolithics, ancient Indo-Europeans, Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, a fierce nation was forged, and it only took a few years of the concept of peace as an ideal to see it come crashing down to new lows never before seen in European lands. It's therefore my belief that peace is more dangerous to a people than warfare, and it proves the old Latin adage, "Qui vis pacem para bellum." If you want peace, prepare for war.
Yes, I definitely share your belief, 100%. And the modern liberal dogma of peace at any cost, the idolization of peace, is the most unnatural anti-principle, without any connection to reality, without any connection to human nature, to the laws of nature, and of course, without any connection to the eternal order of the world. Peace at all costs is a poisonous doctrine whose cunning imposition in the mentality of the Europeans as the most dominant moral value and the primary and standard strategy of our governments is one of our enemy's greatest accomplishments, in order to subjugate us and lead us into an inevitable suicidal route of self-elimination. I wish now to look further in the psychology of the hero, the heroic mentality that characterizes and differentiates the hero from the common man. The heroic mentality is based upon the fundamental principle that life is an endless struggle, a continuous strive, never ultimately completed, even when some specific goals are accomplished. A struggle against nature, against others, and mainly against ourselves, our egos, our faults, and our passions. The greatest reformer of the 20th century verbalized this idea in a very famous and most insightful dictum. Those who want to live, let them fight. And those who don't want to fight in this world of eternal struggle do not deserve to live. The hero sees this struggle as an integral part of his being, as a mission granted to him by destiny, a mission that he willingly accepts and throws himself wholeheartedly in dangers and adventures, and attracts on him all the storms and thunders of the world in order to protect the common man. And he does this not because of altruism or philanthropy, but because he knows this is a duty of the chosen few, to be crushed for others, by the others, a most valuable privilege. The hero is not the flower, nor the fruit. He is the seed that must be buried and rotten for the flower and the fruit to come. His whole being represents a future. The hero strides through life richly and intensely. But this doesn't mean that he indulges in the delights and pleasures of life. He tries them just enough to get over them. He knows them just enough to understand that in the end they will paralyze his power and make him deviate from his path. And ultimately, pleasure seeking is for those who want to take from life. The hero doesn't want to take, he wants to give. The hero lives many lives simultaneously. He experiences intensely all the opposite drugs and tensions of the personality. He is flooded, almost overwhelmed, by all the dramatical emotions and impressions of the psyche, and he fearlessly explores all the dark corners of his mind. But for the hero, this inner, we can call it multiplicity, never leads to dissolution, to splitting or polarization. The core of his personality is never blurred or shaken, his concentration never lost. He wouldn't be a hero if he wasn't a strong personality, and strong personality means strong central character that restrains all the adventures of the mind, subdues all the dispersive tensions within, controls all emotions and instincts in a firm and harmonious inner unity. And this harmonious unity of spiritual and intellectual balance, combined with outer physical beauty and health, was our ancestors' greatest ideal, especially in the Greek classical civilization. And the legendary stories, the tasks and accomplishments of the heroes of all the Aryan mythologies and traditions, symbolize in great extent the struggle of the hero to realize this ideal, as he fights against multiple egos, vanity, fear, despair, delusion, corruption, and all the passions, deficiencies, and weaknesses of the personality, symbolized in the myths by monsters, giants, trolls, and so on. Both the personality and the life of the hero is so rich that any single side of it can be the whole world for a common man. He's a multitasker, but not because of outer pressure or in chasing success, but because his rich intellect and his will to act and create find expression on many levels, many paths, and countless different tasks. He doesn't know success, and success, as understood by the many, doesn't know him. He's not here to be popular. That would mean that he must adapt and conform. He's not after material wealth. He knows that it's temporary and corrupting. He doesn't seek approval, and he doesn't need supporters. He is the center of himself, free in his isolation, aristocratic and distant to the common man, unmovable from his personal beliefs, and unshaken from his sense of personal responsibility. He doesn't envy or antagonize others. He doesn't need others to affirm his ideas and the path he's chosen. He knows that it's not the content of a man's ideas that matters, but the strength and honor it takes to conquer, to stand for, and to defend his ideas. It's not what he believes, but how he believes in it. And when the hero defends his ideas and his way of life, he doesn't do it in order to impose them on others. He does it in order to remain who he is. And when the common man understands who the hero is and what he represents, loath and envy arises, as the common man cannot tolerate the truth that the hero stands for. He cannot tolerate his bravery that he lacks. He cannot fathom his grand vision, which reminds the common man that he has succumbed and capitulated in all the greater challenges of life. The heroic man is not a popular person to the masses. The acknowledgement of his actions and personality is usually a posthumous and after-death issue. For the masses, he appears even sometimes to be insane. And he is insane, like a child who doesn't have this over-celebrated sense of realism, which in reality is indolence and cowardness to dare, to believe, to hope and to act. And the child is a child because it still believes unconditionally, and the hero is blessed with eternal youth. His vigor, his vitality, and his radiation are beacons of divine youth in the ever-aging and decaying world around him. And for the hero, his sense of personal honor and his unmovable devotion to duty is not a burden, not an obstacle. It's liberation. He's a free man because he's transcended by his service and loyalty to these higher values, over and away from the enslaving and corrupting trivialities, deceptions, and attachments of life. The life of a hero is usually short. Not, however, in the common sense. He may actually live for many years, but there will always be too few compared to the vastness of his vitality and the greatness and complicity of his vision. Of course, it is often short in the common sense as well, because he usually spends all his life on the perilous front line of war. War, struggle, and conflict, both outside, physically, and inside. He doesn't know peace, he doesn't retrieve, and he doesn't retire. He's aware that he can never put down his sword and shield. He can never slacken his defenses, drop his guard, and lessen his caution and alertness. Swaying between excitement over enthusiasm and then indifference and withdrawal is the way of the common man, the man who lacks motivation, lacks insight, and lacks a steadfast persuasion. It is the way for those whose inner core, whose personality lacks the strength to withstand and handle a world of continuous change and uncertainty. The heroic man is a pillar with deep roots that always points in one direction, and his final destiny is death. Death gives meanings to his life. Death is the final action that seals all the actions of his life, and only death is his life complete. And the death of a hero is an explosion. The weak and coward tremble, the scornful silence, and his enemies dare not rejoice, because deep inside they know that his spirit and legacy will be a force much more powerful than he ever was. Heroism is more evident, more recognizable in situations of crisis and danger, where one's personality is put on the test, where one's body and soul is pushed to the limits, and where the outcome of the challenge is unknown, and of course where one's life is threatened. And that's why heroism is usually a phenomenon of war. Now, heroism during crisis, threat and danger has always fascinated me. In times of crisis, something mystical happens. Something great and out of this world, something metaphysical, awakens in the soul. People suddenly find an, up until then, hidden and unknown to them strength and motivation to rush into danger, into a rain of bullets, against unbeatable odds, to almost certain death. And not only at a battlefront, it can be in an attempt to save somebody from a burning house, for example, or in a stormy sea that will almost certainly claim their own lives as well. So, momentarily, they go against all their survival instincts, which are so deeply rooted inside. Momentarily, they overcome all their fears and hesitations. Momentarily, they forget their family, their career, their money, and everything they hold dear, and rush to their deaths. Something breaks in them. Chains that have been holding them back magically loosen. A sharp moment of insight eliminates all rational thoughts, and a liberating sense of clarity takes control, powerful like a thunder, irresistible. It's a momentary enlightenment, enlightenment as described in the Indo-Aryan and Buddhist traditions, where the bonds of the relative, transitory and elusive world we live in break, and the mind, free for an instant, experiences the limitless grandness and beauty of the absolute and the eternal. And if this moment will be the last moment in a man's life, what better credentials and merits can he take with him in the next life? The Elysian fields await. If he survives, he transforms into the highest and most noble version of himself. And this is the true reward of the heroic man. It seems, however, that this transformation of a common man into a hero, under pressure and in danger, may happen to many. It is possible, and history has shown us, that simple, idle, even corrupted men can become instant heroes under specific conditions. Especially in the scenery of war, where heroism is encouraged and even expected. It occurs easier and more often than one would think. The true hero, however, is the one that carries this mentality throughout his life, the one whose personality is strong and unwavering, whose mind stands firm against the ever-changing trends, illusions, and temptations of life, and whose inner being is an unshakable axis, always pointing upwards. The man whose integrity is incorruptible, whose sense of honor is his most valuable possession, the man whose sense of personal duty liberates and uplifts him, and whose energy and labor are totally dedicated to the path and the cause he chose to serve, with self-sacrifice and against all odds. Personally, I have been privileged, and still am, to be around men of this aristocratic, heroic Aryan stock, to have learned by them and be inspired by them, to see how heroically they stride through life, how they affect and influence others, how they accomplish tasks and goals that may seem impossible. These modest, aristocratic, superior ascetics whose personality radiates truthfulness, nobility, and vigor, who work relentlessly on all fronts for the benefit of their people and essentially for the well-being of the whole world, with a sacred sense of duty and an inner persuasion that moves mountains. And my hope for the future of our race lies exclusively on these heroes who personify the finest and most authentic qualities of our people. To these heroes of our race, we wish to dedicate today's episode. To our fallen comrade, Axel Eriksson, who found his calling, embraced his duty, and followed the heroic path, and rejoices in Valhalla, side by side with his forefathers, preparing for the final battle. To our comrades in the movement, who tirelessly labor, sweat, and bleed for our sacred cause, with courageous self-sacrifice, immeasurable patience, unbroken will, and aristocratic sense of duty and responsibility. To all the champions of our race all over the world, who chose a harsh path of virtue, who chose to stand up and fight, who chose the path of the hero and not the fear of the victim, the indifference of the egoist, and the shame of the traitor. We salute you. Before we finish for today, I would like to take up one final subject: the idea of the hero in contrast to that of the martyr. We have talked in detail about the Aryan perspective of the heroic ethos, the personality and the philosophical and metaphysical dimensions of the hero in our traditions and how we understand it. The term martyr seems to the non-diligent observant as almost a synonym to the term hero, and it is often used as such, unfortunately, even in our political and ideological circles. Originally, a martyr was someone who was persecuted and executed for his religious beliefs, but now the term is used more broadly and includes persecution and death for other beliefs as well, political, social, or any kind of firm persuasion which the martyr will not renounce at the threat of death. In our modern days, where cultural Marxism sweeps over all aspects of public opinion, and where all values have been reversed, and all authentic and noble concepts and meanings have been distorted and degraded, a martyr can be any passive, weak, decadent individual who is falsely given the status of a martyr by the system, in order always to serve a specific, subversive and disorientating agenda, and almost exclusively against white people. In the combatant Muslim world, to my understanding, the word martyr is synonym to hero. This martyr dies heroically in action, in war, for his faith, Islam. And as we said, it's not what you believe in, but how you believe in it, how you choose to fight and die for it. The concept of the martyr is Semitic in its origins, and by Semitic we mean not only racially and ethnically, but also culturally, so that is Jewish, Islamic and Christian. It crystallizes very deep and fundamental conceptions and attitudes of the Semitic people, and stands as an antipode to the Aryan ideal of the hero. The most well-known martyrs of the Western world are those from early Christianity, when Christianity was still a heresy of Judaism, which actually means a branch of Judaism, in the late times of the Roman Empire and before it became the official religion of the Byzantine Empire. We know the stories of the early Christian martyrs who were fed to the lions and burned alive because they wouldn't renounce their faith. But all these stories are to some extent fabricated and exaggerated regarding the cause and the severity of the punishment. The truth is, however, that only few early Christians were sentenced to death by the Romans, compared to the amount of death sentences at the time, which was not unusual, and most importantly, it wasn't just for their faith. The Roman Empire was tolerant to all religions of its subjects, as long as they would obey the empire's laws. And this religious tolerance was actually one of the reasons that led to its decline, when the central, traditional Roman religion, philosophy, and mentality was infiltrated and undermined by alien, often Oriental, elements and worldviews. The Christians were punished mainly when they would refuse to do their obligatory military service as citizens of the empire, or when they would refuse to bear weapons for the sake of the empire, just like the Jehovah's Witnesses do today in those European countries that still have a mandatory military service. The most famous and extended persecution of Christians from the Emperor Diocletian at the 3rd century AD, the persecution mostly exaggerated by Christian historians, was a final, desperate attempt to defend and cleanse the empire from the rapidly spreading Christian faith that was gaining followers high up in the military and administrative ranks, and was operating as a subversive, infiltrative, and antagonizing force, opposing and denying fundamental Roman traditions, threatening the very structural cohesion and function of the whole empire. And what should Diocletian do? Abandon the empire and succumb to a religion and worldview so distant and alien to the Roman ways? His persecution of the Christians lasted only a few years, and the number of victims bleaks in comparison to the victims of the Christian persecutions against the pagans that lasted for many centuries. The most famous martyr of Diocletian's persecution of the Christian was a young Greek from Cappadocia, an army officer, later known as St. George. His story is uncertain and seems to be enriched with time by Christian historians, very similar to the stories of many Christian martyrs. He was a high military officer who was asked to renounce his faith and pledge allegiance to the emperor like everybody else. George of Lydda, as was his real name, denied. He was tortured in many different brutal ways, but always came out uninjured because of divine protection, until he was beheaded. He became one of the most important saints of the Christian Church, but his death as a martyr was forgotten, and instead he was transformed by the European spirit and in the European tradition into a hero, a militant, manly fighter who rides his horse and kills a dragon, leader and protector of the army, invoked in war cries, a model of chivalry, a hero of medieval legends, an archetype of a knight. Because the European spirit and worldview is alien to the concept of the martyr, the victim who bends the knee, awaiting salvation by divine interception, and whom passively walks to his death, hypnotized and neutralized by a desperate sense of hope for something better in the afterlife. And the original figure of St. George, and many other similar saints, was an infiltration of a genuine Semitic archetype imposed by the Christian Church in the European faith. But the only way for such a foreign element to be accepted, especially in relation to the army, was to be fully and utterly transmuted into the familiar and heroic archetype of the dragon-slaying, noble Aryan hero. Another similar Semitic archetype of a martyr that had become a European Christian tradition is that of the three young men in the furnace. The story goes like this. At the time of the captivity of the Jews by the Babylonians, under King Nebuchadnezzar, the king appreciated Prophet Daniel, who was alive then, and asked him to send 3 Israelites as advisors in his court. Daniel sent 3 young men, Ananias, Azariah, and Mishael. According to this version of the story, King Nebuchadnezzar erected a huge gold statue of himself and asked his subjects to worship him like a god. The 3 young Israelites refused and were thrown in a furnace, a big oven to be burned alive, as usual, and they were uninjured and rescued by divine intervention. Does this sound familiar? The furnace, the victims, the young Jews burned in the oven? Does it? Yeah, food for thought. An interesting detail is that these 3 Israelites, now saints of the Orthodox Church, in some European countries are the patrons and protectors of the fire department, which is a paradox. The fire department, this heroic institution, the only organization that counts so many casualties in time of peace, had adopted as patrons these 3 Jewish, not Christian, martyrs who never fought the fire, but expected to be rescued from it by an angel from above. We, the Europeans, find ourselves today once more in a time of great crisis, mainly a crisis of identity. And in order to come victorious out of this existential threat that hangs like a sword over our heads, we need to rediscover and embrace our genuine essence and character, our great potentiality and calling, which lies crystallized and immortalized in the Aryan archetype of the hero, not the martyr. In this war of identity and ideas, both inner in our personalities and outer in politics and culture, we have to rediscover our authentic values and principles, our authentic essence, and become once more ourselves. This is also a process of observation and distinction of what is authentic Aryan and thus fitting and natural for us, and what is not. And this process of discrimination must include even the most fine and deep undertones of meanings and ideas that have been distorted by a cunning, subversive, and very difficult to see infiltration of alien conceptions, which undermine the very foundations of our character. In every battle we choose to take, every struggle we choose to throw ourselves in, both inside against the worst part of ourselves and outside in our lives and against what is threatening our people and cultures, let us be inspired by the archetype and the mentality of the hero, not the martyr, because victory will only come by our own labor, our own sacrifice, and our own perseverance.
Now that we've established the hero and the noble castes that create and maintain a truly heroic people, it's time for Freja to walk us through some of the initiatory practices of our ancestors. It is one thing to talk of what these men, kings, priests, warriors were, but it is another thing entirely to talk of how they became the heroes that we know them as today. A sense of heroic initiation is key to any healthy people throughout history, as is a sense of reverence for those who achieve these noble heights. We hope that by exploring these ancient traditions, we might do our own small part in rekindling this sacred flame, this spirit of heroism, as it is needed now more than ever.
The title of my talk is Maiden Mythology in Norse Society. I'll be speaking about the role of the goddess, the giantess, and the Valkyries, played out in Norse society when it comes to initiating kings and warriors. I'll be exploring the purpose of initiations called sacred marriage and the esoterica behind finding a spirit spouse. The great psychologist Carl Jung have greatly contributed to our understanding of the unconscious influence of the archetypes. I'll be speaking about this, as well as the process of how to become more self-aware and how we can integrate the shadow self in our psyche. I'll be mentioning about the greatest archaeological findings in Scandinavia since Viking Age, related to two vulvas, as well as to a historical event from the last pagan temple of Uppsala. Lastly, I'll be speaking about the halls of initiation, Valhall and Folkvang, and about the Norse divination of Seidre and Galdre, and the mediators of the ceremonies, the Gudjas, the Vulvas, and the Valas. Sacred marriage, or heros gamo as it's called in Greek, is part of an ancient Germanic, Celtic, and Scandinavian mythology and culture. It was practiced in one form or another in Scandinavia throughout the Nordic Bronze Age. This is shown in rock carvings of that period. Heros gamos is a ritual or a union between a god and a goddess, or between a divine and a human being. It's a sacred matrimony between a king and a goddess with the purpose to establish kingly authority and hierarchy for the king and his territory and the warband. Kingship demanded a sacred foundation that could be provided only through the omnipotence of the great goddess. The Hierogamos myth was very important for the ideology of royal lines. The king or ruler represented a being that was descended from a god and a giantess, and they were representatives of cosmic polarity. The ritual could symbolically enhance or maintain the cosmic order between a sky father and an earth goddess, with the purpose of bringing fertility and prosperity to the land, where the rain and sun from the sky shall fertilize the earth and the ground. The rituals of initiation into kingship or rulership was connected to a death and resurrection symbolism, and with the purpose to be found worthy of the gift of immortality. Immortality was not for everyone. This gift required profound understanding about oneness of polarities. In other words, having tasted the perfect harmony and balance of the feminine and the masculine, of a king and queen, and god and goddess. The idea of an offering of mead by a gold-adorned lady was a powerful tradition in many Germanic societies from the earliest times up to Viking Age. The queen or the lady would enter the hall in a prescribed manner, offering mead to the king with a formal greeting and then giving him advice. The king then had to swear an oath to the goddess, and when the king accepted the drink and her holy embrace, he was then fit to be king. She would then proceed to the other warriors in the hall according to their status, offering the same mead and in return receive an oath of eternal loyalty. The ritual would be a communal bonding rite between the warriors, but at the same time an expression of lordship, hierarchy, and rank. Through her role in the ritual, the lady would also act as a delegate for the king. She sanctified the status of each warrior, and this bonded the band of the warriors like brothers, as well as into a big family. Her presence was essential, and her cheering words and gifts made a harsh life more bearable. This ritual was the crowning reward of the battle-tired warrior. Mead is meant to be intoxicating and create an altered state of mind. But intoxication without symbolic understanding of the ritual is useless. Symbolically, the mead represents the knowledge and wisdom of the gods. It also comes with a purpose: to make poetry, to become a skald, to bring wisdom and knowledge, to wake up our blood memory, or to obtain the mead of immortality. So the mead have many names and many purposes. The cult of the maiden mythology recognize a great goddess. She is called the gold-adorned lady of the mead of wisdom, poetry, and immortality. She is also called the bright and shining one. She is the initiator of immortality, and she have many names. In other Indo-European cultures, there is a drink called soma, or Sanskrit haoma. It's an early Vedic ritual drink that brings ecstasy, healing, and immortality. And the guardian of the soma was said to be a serpent. And there is a parallel in Norse myth with the story of Odin transforming himself to a snake to get into the chamber where the mead was kept and guarded by the giantess Gunnlöd. So the mead is a life elixir, a liquor by which one achieves ecstasy and thus communion with the supernatural, and much more. Mead can be made many different ways, but the main ingredients are raw unpasteurized honey and pure water and yeast, natural or artificial yeast, and then some flavoring, fruit, herbs, and spices. We use a lot of mead here in Scandinavia when we hold our bloots, and most of the mead is homemade. And let me just tell you a little personal story. When I was at a blute, I was given some mead, and the person was from Skåne. He was a skald, which means he can speak poetry very good. And his name was Loke. And anyway, so he gave me some of his meat, and I said, wow, this is really good. And he said, he leaned over and said, would you like to know the secret ingredients? And I said, yes. And he said, well, it's berries from the hawthorn tree that you can more or less only find here in Skåne. And then it's my spit. Just like the gods of old, he said. And then he raised his horn that was adorned with ornaments and beautiful runes. And he said, Skål! And I said, Skål! But I wasn't sure if I wanted to drink any more of that mead. Anyway, I will tell you a bit later of how the mead was created by the gods, and you'll be surprised. Before I get into Norse mythology, and especially maiden mythology, I shall mention something about spirit spouse and what the great psychologist Carl Jung say about conjunctio, which is sacred marriage. So the spirit spouse, or soror spiritus, it's about a union between feminine and masculine. And the shamans and the sages, they have known this for ages, that one can never achieve the spiritual heights all by oneself. It's only when the two polarized feminine and masculine meet and become one with each other. Then there is a creation process that takes place. And it's in that perfect union that a new life brings forth. In Tantric Buddhism, they also talk about the union with the spirit spouse. It involves a special rite and initiations. It's sometimes described as an alternative route to achieving enlightenment, a sort of spiritual shortcut, perhaps even in a single lifetime. The practices is about unity and oneness of the feminine and the masculine, and it's about raising the Kundalini power up the spine to reach the pineal gland, which is in the middle of our brain, and that's considered to be our spiritual antenna. And with succeeding with this practice, one can reach spiritual heights of wisdom and understanding beyond that you would be able to achieve all by yourself. Carl Jung, he also speaks about sacred marriage, conjunctio, of oneness. But it's not oneness between two individuals, but it's rather an alchemical process that takes place when we enter into the transformative process that comes through self-awareness. Conjunctio that Jung refers to is the union of our divine spirit, our soul and our body. And when the individuation process is complete, the divine spirit has been brought down to shine through the soul and the body, and everything is unified. These three components that we have. A simpler way to explain it would be to say that by this process, every living organism becomes what is defined to become from the beginning. Carl Jung talks about a split in our minds between what's conscious and what's unconscious. And the individuation process brings our psyche to wholeness. He also talks about the tension of opposites between the masculine and the feminine, and the masculine seeks more autonomy, and the feminine seeks communion and relationship. And repressing the tension of these sides of us makes us one-sided, and it leads us to project our unconscious fantasies onto reality, as well as repress and push the pressure out of our consciousness. The psychiatrist Carl Jung also speaks about archetypes. He says that the archetypes are the fundamental units of the human mind, and they are the secret forces behind all human behavior. He describes the archetypes as forms or images. Examples would be the concept of the mother and the father, the warrior, the sage, the child, the king, the queen. And there are many types of archetypes that we can find in ancient religions and myth and legends. Archetypes resides in our unconscious mind. That's the part of our mind we're not aware of, and they influence us without us knowing it. The archetypes are hiding an unconscious spark of lights from which a higher meaning can be extracted. So I wonder, how much does the archetypes of the North pantheon of gods influence us and our psyche up here in the North? Since we have forgotten our mythologies and lost our culture and our history. We used to have strong concepts like the noble woman initiating kings and warriors, and we had the strong clan society where honor was a valuable commodity to be protected unto death. And now this is gone, but it's coming back as well. So we are living in an exciting time because of that. Another concept that Jung talks about is doing your shadow work. And everyone carries a shadow, Jung says, the shadow is hidden and repressed for the most part. It's the inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramification reach back into the realm of our animal instincts. And the less this shadow is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Maybe mankind have suppressed the shadow self for so long that humans are becoming more animal-like. It's kind of a devolution process rather than an evolution. And one does not become enlightened by imaging figures of light, but it's by the hard work of making the darkness conscious in our life. Jung also says the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. There is a balance concept in that. A simpler way to explain this could be to say that we accept and we transcend the good, the bad, and the ugly in ourselves. There is another poet and esoteric author that I would like to mention, and his name is Miguel Serrano. And it paints a similar picture with the concept of the perfect match and the union between the feminine and the masculine. His esoteric poem says that the her came out of him and that they were joined from the beginning of times and they were separated. And the purpose of life's journey is to get back together again. So he says like this, there's only one her for each him, and she is the her that came out of him. In the turning of the wheel of the eternal return, it's not always given for them to meet. One or the other might arrive late or early, but if they do manage to meet, everything must be put at stake to bring her back to life. And he goes on to say that the goal is immortality, and it's the woman that gives the man the elixir of no death. He says the woman's road is that of magic, eternal love. She hands her lover the chalice of the grail, filled to the brim with the liquor of immortality. For the woman is the world through the chakras through which her hero must travel. A woman is Kundalini. A woman has no soul. She is the soul. A woman has no eternity. She is eternity. So Serrano is also leaning on this synchronization to bring back the perfect balance, the unity, the oneness between the her that came out of him. And this is the way that creation continues beyond our understanding. Since I've talked about the mead and the purpose of this elixir, I'll do a quick backdrop into Norse mythology and to see how the mead came about. So there was a war between the pantheon of the gods, gudaätterna, and the Aesir's. They had tried 3 times to burn and kill the very powerful vulva Gullveig, and she was a Vanir goddess, but she could not be killed, even though they tried to burn her. And Odin, he threw his spear, and peace was declared in the land. And then the high priestess Lady Freja, she was appointed to be the Blutgudja in the high hall, and she then instructed the gods to pour their divine essence into a cauldron and kittel. And the pantheon of the gods, they spat and collected their saliva in this cauldron and filled it with the power of divine union. and with all of their knowledge. Out of this was Kvasir was created, and he's the personification of infinite wisdom and knowledge. He was created by the gods, and he moved freely through the worlds. And there were peace in the land, and there were peace between the pantheon of gods, the Assyrs and the Veneers, and it was called the time of Balder, the golden age, and in Old Norse it's called Frodafridre. Until the dwarfs, Fjalar and Galar, they killed Kvasir and drained his blood into a big cauldron in Kittel, and they mixed his blood with honey. And this then became the poetic mead of memory. And it was according to the saga stored in the mountain Hintbjörg by the giant Suttinger, and it was kept by his daughter Gunnlöd, who is said to be the lady of the mead, the golden and bright maiden of wisdom, and she had many names. So now you know how the mead was created by the gods. I'd like to go into another very rare discovery made in Norway 1904. It was a barrier mound there, and they excavated a Viking ship from around 840 AD. It's called Oseberg, the Oseberg ship, and it's considered to be the greatest burial site from Viking age. But I believe even recently they have found a similar barrier ship that they will excavate. That will be very interesting. There had been grave robbers, and they had already removed the precious metals and the jewelry. They first believed that the grave belonged to a highly esteemed person, a king or a partly divine person, but it turned out to be two tiny old women that was buried in the ship, and they are most likely vulvas from Viking age, sailing along the coast of Norway and Sweden with the purpose of initiating kings and performing magic through rituals like Seid and maybe even rune magic, another kind of Norse divinations. In the beautifully decorated oak ship, there was found several wooden decorated wagons, and some were sledges, and they believe that the vulvas might have used them going into the sea villages in a procession with horses or some other animals driving the wagons. They found in the ship 15 sacrificed horses, 4 dogs and 1 ox, and a lot of other items, both practical and religious, and musical instruments were found as well. There were artifacts from other parts of the world. A Persian blanket was found, and a very unique Buddha statue in lotus position with a sun wheel or a swastika on the chest. The 2 women, one aged between 70 or 80 and the other about 50 years old, were placed together in a large matrimonial bed with wooden poles. And there were additional 6 beds found in the grave. And one of the women wore a fine red wool dress with white linen veil in a gauze weave, and the other woman a blue wool dress. And both the maidens maintained healthy teeth, and they used toothpicks. And all these components about the women spoke for that they had high rank and had value in their society. On one bucket from the Oseberg ship there is a runic inscription, and it said Sigrid owns this bucket. So Sigrid may have been the name of one of the women in the grave. There was also detailed tapestry to reveal some of the rituals performed by the vulvas, and it shows a procession of women surrounded by serpents, as well as some kind of mushrooms that we think could be what we call in Sweden flugsvamp. I'd like to speak about another event that has taken place here in Scandinavia, or rather in Sweden, in Uppsala. And that is an offer feast. We know that our forefathers offered gifts and animals sacrificed to the Norse gods for the purpose of getting good crop and god årsväxt. But every 9 years there was an offer feast in the temple of Uppsala. And the gods that they offered to was Thor, Odin and Frey, and they were displayed on the wall on the heathen temple. So both animals, but very rarely humans, as self-sacrifice is believed to have taken place with the purpose of awakening the favor of the gods to bring good crops and prosperity in the land. And if there was miscrop several years in a row, it could be that the king offered himself to be sacrificed, and the folk had to elect another king that were bestowed with more favor from the great goddess. And we know all this from Ynglingasagan, that the Svearnas kung Domalde, Svearna came from the east coast of Sweden. He offered himself in the last pagan temple in Uppsala. And there have been years of miscrop, and the gods were obviously not pleased with the king. There is a famous painting by Carl Larsson called Midvinterblot, painted on the wall in a national museum in Stockholm. I will now talk about the high halls of initiations. Freja is obviously both a fertility god and a war goddess, and she had a place called Folkvang, or we say Folkeng, which means the field of folk. And this is the realm of Freja, and her hall was called Sätesrymne, which means rymlig på sittplatser, room that accommodate many seats. And Valhall is the realm of Odin, and his great hall is called Gladsheim. And the Valkyries, they choose the most noble and skilled and fearless warrior to be transported either to Folkvang or Valhall. And these fallen but yet again living warriors are called enhärjare. Valhall is described, among other places, in Grimnismal. And Odin's Valhall surrounding, like I said, is called Gladsheim. It means bright home, den glansfulla världen. And Gladsheim can also be considered to be a court, a hov, and is golden adorned both on the inside and on the outside. And it's located in the middle of Asgård on Idavallen, where the gods meet. And in Valhall there are 12 high seats for the gods. Valhall means the hall of the slain, and Odin, who has many names, his name Ropt, he each day fetched the sword of the slain heroes. And at the entrance in the west of the hall, one can find the eagle head bowing down over the wolf, and all who enter Gladsheim shall recognize it by the shields and the spears and armors being found all over the hall. It's the greatest and most solid built domain ever built, and the house have 540 doors, and as many as 800 warriors or enhärjare can march through one door at the same time. And the myth tells us that the doors are very wide. And the Edda describes how the warriors march out every morning to Idavallen in the middle of Asgård, where they all day long work on their war skills and fighting against each other And at dusk they put themselves together again. They rise up and march back to the majestic, enormous hall of the fallen, where the gourmet chef Andrimner have prepared a feast, and they eat the meat of the boar and they drink the meat from the goat Heidrun. And the warriors, enhärjarna, can drink and eat as much as they would like, and the festivities shall repeat itself night after night. At the time of Ragnarök, the rooster Gyllenkam shall crow at Valhall's roof, and Odin then shall lead the warriors to the battlefield Vigrid, where the last battle shall be between the giants and the Aesir. And the naming of Vigrid means krigsritt, or martial ride, or war ride. And this could indicate that Ragnarök shall be fought on horseback. It is said that Vigrid, meaning the battle of the field, is Holme. It's an island called Oskopne. And this makes sense because our forefathers, when they were settling dispute, they went holmgång. They went out to an island to settle the duel. There is another great hall built in Valhall called Vingolf, or in Sweden would be Vengolv, the floor of the friends. And this is a hall for the Asynjer, the female Aesir goddesses. And it's great splendor, but it has nothing to do with Freja's folkvang. I will now say something about Freja's folkvang and the Valkyries. They are the one that choose the most noble and skilled and fearless warrior to be transported either to folkvang or Valhall. And half of the slain warriors go to Freja's folkvang, and the other half goes to Valhall. But it seems that most of the enhärjare, of the warriors, goes to Odin's Valhall for further combat training and preparing for the forthcoming Ragnarök. But there could have been warriors that had reached a stage of completion or through initiations that did go to Freja's folkvang instead. This is speculation on my part, but it could be that since Freja is the initiator of immortality and she is the one that chose first, so it could be that they didn't have to go around the mountain again, so to speak, but they had already reached a level of consciousness and initiation, and so they didn't have to go to war again. The Lady Freja, she's the leader of the Valkyrie. And Valkyria is a combination of Val, which means the fallen warrior, and Kora means to choose one, so they are the chooser of the slain. In Norse mythology, it's the women that initiates men into the world of the gods. And Valkyrie is also called själaförare, or soul travelers. Most of us are familiar with Richard Wagner's fabulous opera, Valkyria. It seems as the Valkyrie doesn't die, and there are many names spoken on in the Eddas, and most of the names reflect something that has to do with the battlefield. I'll just read some of the names. Gun, that means strid or battle. Gull, tumult or riot. Herfjutrur, that means krigsboja or war shackle. Hildre, strid or combat. Hrist, skakaren, the shaker. Kora, storm. And mist means dimma. And rota, oordning, disorder, means that's a funny Valkyrie name. Sigrun means segeruna, victory rune, and Thurd, makt and power, and Reinleif, gudasänd, and Skäggjuld, yxtid, axe time, Skågul, högrest, tal, Gondol, trollstav, bärerska. Oh, I'm not going to even interpret that. The bearer of the... yeah, whatever. We can read about the Valkyrie Sigdrifa in the Edda Sigdrifamal, and where she speaks of the runes, and she gives wisdom words to folk and foe. So Sigdrifa, she slew Hjalm Gunnar in a battle that Odin had promised victory to him. And Odin then pricked the Valkyrie with sleep thorn in punishment for this, and said that you should never thereafter win victory in battle, and that you shall also be wedded. You should get married. And the Valkyrie Sigdrifa, she said to Odin, I have made an oath and a vow not to marry. And even if I did, it would be to the most fearless man that there is. And in Fafnismal, we can read about how Sigurd tasted the blood of the dragon Fafnir. And then all of a sudden, he understands the birds. And they speak to him and they tell him to go to a place where the Valkyrie Sigdrifa sleeps. And Sigurd rode to Hindar mountain and went into the place and saw there a man lay and sleep in full armor. He took off the helmet and opened the brynjan and saw that it was a woman warrior. And she woke up, and then she proceeded to teach Sigurd the wisdom of the runes. And in Volupsa we can read what the Valkyrie Sigdrifa said. She said, Hail dog's sons, hail Nut and Nipt, look down upon us with benevolent eyes, and give victory to the sitting. Hail Asas, hail Asynjus, hail bounteous earth, words of wisdom give to us noble twain, and healing hands in life. And she then gave the advice to carve victory runes on the sword. It should be the Tyruna to go for protection. And she said, victory runes you must know if you will have victory, and carve them on your sword's hilt, some on the grasp and some on the inlay, the name Tyr twice, and this shall protect you. She also talked about a magical combination of runes that is well known, and it's called Alle runes. It's a combination of As, Lago, and the ear rune, the horse rune, and that makes up the number 24, which is the Fe rune. She said you should know the birth runes and wave runes and branch runes and speech runes and thought runes, all these different kind of runes. And she continued to give some advice, and she said, be honest to friends, keep an oath, and don't argue with unaware and stupid folk. Don't be guests with evildoers. Be careful with beautiful and cunning women. Don't get drunk. Fight rather than die in the fire. Don't ever believe enemies' oaths to harm you. Watch out for false friends. In maiden mythology, the goddess also embraced the world of the giantess, the Jotun. And giantess is also called Gugjar, but she's mostly called giantess, and that means eater or devourer. The giantess disguised as the maiden is creative and powerful and has magical powers. For instance, the giantess Grid supplied Thor with magical gifts. He was giving the girdle of might, the magical iron gloves, and the magical wand. And the giantess Jad, she's described as brilliant and beautiful, and her naked arms illuminated the air and the sea. Frey fell in love with her at first sight, and the poetic Edda and the poem Skirnismal, she first refused Freyr's proposal to marry, but after that Skirnir, which is Freyr's messenger, threatened to use Freyr's sword to cover the earth in ice, then she agreed to marry Frey, and she became the mother of the mythic Swedish king Fjölnir. And then we have the giantess Skade. She journeyed to Asgard to avenge her father Pjasi, whom the gods had killed. And she agreed not to avenge the gods if they allowed her to choose a husband among them, and if they succeeded in making her laugh. And the gods allowed her to choose a husband, but she had to choose him only from his feet. And she chose Njord because his feet were so beautiful that she thought it was Balder. And then Loki succeeded in making her laugh, so peace was made, and Odin made 2 stars from Pjasi's eyes. I will now speak on the Norse divination art of Seidr, or Seid, and Galder. And Seid is an old shamanic ritual with a main purpose to go into trance and visit other worlds. It's mainly done by women, even though the Lady Freja taught the art of Seidr to Odin, but he was mocked by Loki to say that it was a very womanly practice. The crops and weather conditions, but also it was about birth and death of the folk. The vulva, she was serving the folk, and she was respectable and had very important role in the land. And the clairvoyant ability was very often inherited from mother to daughter and from grandmother, and it ran in the family, so to speak. The clairvoyant Seidkona, also called vulva or vala, spådiser or stavbärare, staff bearer, is also a prophetess and a healer. And with her broad knowledge about the times that she lived in and about her love for the people and ability to then transfer herself to other worlds, she can make very good predictions as she comes out of the trance and give warnings about the future. We can read in the Edda about Thorborg. She was a vulva, or Seidkona. She wore a red mantle with borders of white cat skin. She sat on a seidhell, or a kub, a special chair that she was raised a bit, and she wore a staff in her right hand. She is called stavbärerska, the staff bearer, and her maidens sat around her in a ring, and they used drums and hymns, so-called galder, that comes from the word gal. It's a high-pitched sound and very monotone, and it helps to bring the vulva into trance, as well as singing valdlukkurs. Is also very monotone and rhythmic energies that that affect the vulva to go to trance and shapeshift eventually. When the vulva, the saint, couldn't go into trance, she let go of her staff, and the maidens know that she is sort of traveling in other worlds, and they keep a special eye on her so that she can come back. There have been connections made between the vulva staff and what's called slentrissor. It's where you spin the thread of lean, and that indicates that the vulva also did textile work and weaving and twining the yarn, just like the three Norns, Urd, Skuld and Verdandi. They weaved the fates of the people, the fate of the people, and she is also the fate goddess. There is a saga about Orvar Odd, where the vulva predicted the destiny of him. He was the son of Grim Ludenkind and the grandson of Ketil of Håkoland in Norway. And when he was an infant, vulva predicted that he would be killed by his own horse Faxi at the place where he was born, and that he would return 360 degrees. In other words, he would return home. There is a background to why the vulva predicted Oddvarod's fate. His father, Grim, went up north to the White Sea to go fishing because there were no food to eat further south. And there he killed some trollkonor. And this could have been the reason for a generational curse that was put upon Oddvarod. Anyway, so in order to undo this prediction, Oddvarod killed his own horse, and he buried him deep in the ground and left his home intending never to return again. His father gave him some magic arrows, and Oddvarod became a very successful warrior. He won many battles and traveled to many places in the world. But when he encountered Hjalmar, a Swedish champion warrior, he met his match. They fought, but they fought very even, and the two warriors, they not only became friends, but also entered into sworn brotherhood. And the two heroes fought many battles together. And Hjalmar, the Swedish warrior, he was killed in a battle, and Oddvarod had to bring the dead Hjalmar back to Uppsala and hand him over to Hjalmar's betrothed Ingeborg. She was the daughter of the Swedish king. And Oddvarod, he went traveling again. He went south and he was fighting in the Mediterranean, and he was a full-blown pagan, but he had to pretend to be baptized when he was in Sicily. And there he was shipwrecked and arrived alone in the Holy Land. And after this he became homesick and went back home. Walking over the grave of his horse, Faxi, he mocked the old prophecy. And then he tripped over the skull of the horse. And there was a snake that appeared, and the snake bit him, and Oddvarod died. Just as the vulva had predicted, he returned home 360 degrees and was indirectly killed by his own horse, Faxi. So I have now been speaking about Valhall and Folkeng, the realms of Freja and Odin, and maybe some of you wonder what happened to Balder, the bright shining one, the most popular god and the most loved sun god in Norse mythology. Well, he went to Hel, the cold and icy Hel, and at Balder's funeral the giantess Hyrrokin, she came riding on a wolf, and she set the burning ship to sea. After she gave the ship a push, the fire flashes shook the earth. In the prose Edda Gylfaginning we can read about when Odin, the Hellblinder, and Hermod, which means war spirit, the son of Odin, and he is also the brother of Balder, who was killed, they ride to Hel to try to make him come back to life again. The gods were speechless and devastated by Balder's death. So Frigg, the mother of Balder, she asked the Aesir who amongst them would wish to gain all of her love and favor by riding to the road of Hel for Balder's return. So Hermod stood the challenge and rode Odin's 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, for 9 nights through the deep and dark valleys to Hel. At Hel, the bridge covered with shining gold is guarded by the maiden Modgun, and she told Hermod that Balder had already crossed the bridge and that Hermod should ride back and downwards. But Hermod instead, he charged Sleipnir to jump high over the bridge and then came to the gate where he could see Balder seated in the most honorable seat. And Hermod begged the goddess Hel to release Balder, but she replied that Balder could only be released if all things, dead and alive, wept for him. Balder then gave Hermod the ring Draupnir, which had been burned at his funeral, to bring it back to Odin, and Draupnir is the Dripper. It's the magical ring of Odin that multiplies itself every 9th night. There are 8 new rings, that's why it's called the Dripper. And Draupnir was a product made by the most talented craftsmen in cosmos, that is the dwarves. It was when Loki was traveling to the land of the dwarves to ask them to make treasures as a compensation for the gods. Loki, he caused trouble, and Thor, he was threatening to kill him unless he found some treasures to bring back. And the treasures that Loki brought back to Asgard were they were all magical power tools, which included Mjölnir, the hammer of Thor, and Draupnir, the ring of Odin, Gullinbursti, the boar of Frey, and Brisingamen necklace, that belongs to Freja. And thus Balder had to remain in the underworld, not to emerge until after Ragnarök, when the earth descends again from the sea with green and ready to harvest fields. So I will now end this talk with a poem about the shining one, Balder, the most loved of all the gods. Of all the 12 round Odin's throne, Balder the beautiful alone, the sun god, good and pure and bright, was loved by all, as all love light. Thank you very much for listening.
And with that, it's time to bring the episode to a close. We'd like to thank the heroes of our past, the heroes of our time, and the heroes still yet to come. In the next episode, we will be looking into the religion and the gods of ancient Indo-Europeans and how they became known by so many different names and worshipped and honoured differently in so many Indo-European cultures. Until then, you can subscribe to us on YouTube, where we upload these podcasts with some visual accompaniment, as well as some readings of texts we deem to be particularly important. You can also find us on Instagram at aristogenesis.ig. Thank you for listening. Until next time.
You have been listening to Aristogenesis, Episode 3, Initiation of the Hero, presented to you by nordiskradio.se.